Welcome to Narrative Responsibility, a podcast about examining the meta-story of your life, how well it is serving you, and how to change it for the better. I'm Elena Wolf, relationship coach and life alignment mentor, and this is this week's New Perspective. Hi there! I'm so glad you're here today. This is episode 24, Mordor Fun Run. I spent this past weekend grappling with a piece of my shadow. By that I mean a part of my psyche that I had been refusing to face, like refusing to allow existed in me, much less be a part that I actually wanted to work with and integrate. And that's all the term shadow means. It's a part of ourself that we're not consciously aware of and working with. Possibly it's a part that we are consciously resistant to seeing within our own self, but sometimes we can just be completely oblivious, like it doesn't even hit our radar that that part could exist at all. I won't bore you with the specifics of my night in Heorot, except to say that this one was about finding in myself the thing I'm most afraid of in others, which made for a very different kind of facing my worst nightmare experience than like the 4, 5, 6 other times that I've done that in the last 6 years. Hey, gotta keep it fresh, I guess. Anyway, this actually felt like the right time to bring up the whole concept of the shadow, which is pretty popular in personal development circles. It's a Jungian concept, and it's definitely been expanded on from his work as well. It's not a term that I particularly love because I think the term is misleading in some ways, or maybe it's that the mystique around it or the way a lot of people talk about it feels misleading. But it had been so long since I had personally grappled with an aspect of my shadow, at least in a way that felt kind of confronting and big and scary and unplanned. I thought, maybe I'm not in the right place to be talking about that. Well, here I am having had something like that pop up, and it felt like, maybe this is now the moment for me to talk about it and go over this concept and maybe give you some ideas of what to do if you're in a place where you're faced with it. So the shadow. I mean, is that like Mordor or something? That's one way to think about it. A lot of personal development teachers talk about the concept of the shadow like it might as well be Mordor. Like the shadow is this terrifying place of nightmares that unmakes our sense of self and lays bare our most painful inner lies. It burns your ego away like Mount Doom with the One Ring. Ouch. But, I don't know that shadow work necessarily needs that association with danger and fear. Most of the time, it's actually more prosaic than that if you understand what's happening. I have friends who like the term shadow because to them it conveys a sense of mystery to be unraveled or a quest to undertake. Your mileage may vary. If thinking of it as a trip to Mordor gets your adventure juices flowing, then it's a great parallel to think of it that way. And if you prefer the concept of like a video game map where the black squares are places you have not yet explored, that's also a great metaphor. For myself, I prefer to think of my shadow as lost parts of me, pieces of me that got separated and are trying their best to come home. That framing makes me feel compassion and curiosity rather than fear. Or at least it does most of the time. Sometimes that fear is there for a reason, and sometimes it's hard to let go of. You see, anything in our shadow is in our shadow for a reason. Either it's a developmental thing, like we really just have not reached the point of maturity on an emotional or psychological level to be integrating that part of our conscious capacities, or it was put into our shadow because we felt safer splitting that part of ourself off away from our awareness. We don't perform that kind of splitting without very good reason. And even if that reason does come to an end, we get out of that situation or we grow up a little bit more and can actually handle that part of ourself now, we nonetheless remember that that reason did exist once upon a time. And so that awareness of the reason makes taking anything out of our shadow feel a little bit scary. I mean, we banished it for a reason. Why are we going back on that? The process of bringing something out of the shadow usually means either unpacking trauma or slamming your sense of self face first into the hammer of truth and having your illusions about yourself or your life shattered. Those are scary and painful in different ways. It's been a minute since I defined trauma as a concept, so here's a quick recap. Trauma was not merely a painful or wounding experience, but one that we could not heal from at the time. It was something too big for us to process, accept, and integrate at the time when it happened. Either we were not mature enough, or safe enough, or supported enough to really face what had happened, so we suppressed it, like whole cloth. Thus, unlocking trauma often means finally facing the raw, unprocessed emotions as if that original event had just happened. Land of shadows indeed. We can remain avoidant of those experiences because we retain our initial meta emotions about them, which is distress and overwhelm. We assume that it's always how we'll feel about that event rather than considering if we might have gained capacity since then. I mean, an adult can often face what a child can't. But if the child's eyes are the only ones we keep looking at an event through, we're going to keep avoiding it. That's how we can end up keeping stuff suppressed for years, even decades, maybe even for a lifetime, because we're allowing the child's feelings about it to be the ones that dictate whether the adult self will engage with it. So if you have any parts of your personal story that you have never gone back over with adult eyes, you've probably got a lot of discoveries to make by doing so. And I mean, this is true even without trauma. Anybody can be holding on to painful stories or beliefs that your adult self or you as you are now versus you as you were the last time you looked at it might see differently. And here is where the ego can get involved. Right, so the ego is our conscious sense of identity. It is a psychological necessity, a way of curating the signal-to-noise ratio of our inner experience into something that we and others can understand. Ego is not in and of itself a problem. The term gets a bad rap because our ego can become a rigid, self-protective defense mechanism. That type of ego can't allow certain truths to be seen because those truths feel too painful or too unsafe. That type of defensiveness is unhealthy because it stifles growth and it denies reality. An ego that is too defended, too rigid, casts out all the parts of the self it does not like. So any part that is not already integrated into the egoic structure gets excluded from the sense of self, from the sense of conscious identity. In other words, it gets relegated to the shadow. I'm framing the shadow this way for a reason. I'm not making a value judgment on what goes into the shadow. It's just what is overwhelming or threatening to our current consciousness, to our current egoic identity. You see, the shadow is not only for bad or shameful parts of ourselves. We can exile good parts to the shadow too. We can exile parts that are vital and necessary for our thriving into our shadow. We do that when short-term survival necessitates it, or we believe that it is necessary. And just as a side note, In my opinion, no parts of ourself are actually bad or shameful. Only actions are bad. And they're bad in the sense of being hurtful or destructive or damaging or kicking off a string of unintended consequences that we later regret. Actions can cause us to feel shame when we take them as evidence of an inner defect or badness, but we are not our actions. We are never our actions. We can change our actions. We can shift course or make amends, or at the very least, if there's truly nothing to be done, we can learn from the mistake or the action that we took and make better choices going forward. No parts of us are innately bad or wrong, or good for that matter. So our shadow cannot be innately bad or wrong. It's just the parts of us we don't want to admit are part of us. Whether we see those parts as good or bad is really not even the question. We don't want to admit that they're part of us because they threaten our egoic identity. Our egoic identity is based on the stories we believe about ourselves, whether those stories come from ourselves and our own inferences, or if they are something someone else explicitly told us that we have taken on. If we have a story, in other words, an emotional belief that says, if I have X quality, then I am a bad person, or if I have X quality, then I am unlovable, then we are going to do anything we must to avoid having X quality. X cannot be part of us if we're going to be good, if we're going to be loved. But if X is, in fact, a part of us, then building an egoic identity that denies X is building an identity that denies reality. That type of egoic structure will always be fragile because it is built on lies rather than on truth. That type of ego is why egos get a bad rap. And that's because that type of ego can be dangerous if it is threatened. It can lash out at others. It can demand that the world conforms to its twisted perspective. And sometimes it just collapses when presented with the truth. The term ego death comes from how painful it can be to have a defensive egoic structure shatter. When you let go of the lie, you may find that you don't really know what is true anymore. Or maybe you never did. Maybe you were raised in a family or a culture that demanded you show up in a certain way and exile anything that did not conform to that role. Maybe that was the price of admission to that family or that society. So even a fragile ego might exist because at some point it was necessary, or we believed it was necessary. So even these bad egos, they exist for a reason. There's an intent behind them. It might simply be a tool that has now outgrown its use if we are no longer in a situation that requires us to put away parts of ourselves in order to gain acceptance or survival. Our shadow, then, is built of the aspects of ourself and our experiences that we set aside due to beliefs about what is good, what is right, what is safe, what is desirable, what is lovable. The reason that the shadow can feel so dangerous is because it's all the parts of us that contradict those stories. Facing our shadow requires us to confront the internal beliefs we hold, to question what we understand to be true, and potentially to let go of identities and narratives that kept us safe, or at least that we believed kept us safe, which on an emotional level is basically a distinction without a difference. Letting go of a belief that kept you from harm feels like setting down your shield when you stand before the dragon. Or, I guess, to keep the Mordor analogy intact, the Nazgul. It's like just laying it down at their feet and saying, "Here I am. Take me." It is so scary. And how much worse is it to watch the Nazgul hold up not a sword, but a mirror, and show us that we are its twin, so that we can see in ourself the thing that we fear the most in others. That the monster we've been running from exists within our own self too. And now, having seen it, we have to learn to work with it instead of denying it. Well, I mean, I guess we could go back to denying it. Pretty sure plenty of people do. But I am not one of them. I am not going to reject information that is true simply because it is painful or frightening or inconvenient. It's one thing to have not seen this aspect of myself before now. That just means I wasn't ready to see it. I wasn't mature enough. Or I wasn't healed enough. Or I wasn't resourced enough to cope with that truth. My unconscious mind was doing its job and protecting me from something that I wasn't ready to see, that I wasn't ready to integrate. Now it deems me ready. And now that this aspect of myself has been brought to my conscious attention, my conscious I ego self has a choice to accept this truth or to turn away from it. It's a choice to make myself less true and more fragile, or to deepen my self-acceptance and my resilience. Those are the only two choices. And for me, it is no choice at all. I choose growth. I choose the painful, awkward truth over the lie. I choose to confront this truth now, not 10 years from now, when it would inevitably be coming back around anyway. I'm annoyed because this was not in my plans. I'm kind of scared because this is some serious Nazgul level monster stuff for me. I'm tired. I am so tired of being brave and doing hard things. And I'm proud of myself for sticking to my own principles. I'm leaning into the resources of learning and support that I've built to make this process easier on myself. I'm remembering that I don't have to face it alone. After all, Frodo walked into Mordor with Sam at his side. I've got like half a dozen friends and professionals to play Sam for me. And also, I think there's a joke in there somewhere. You know, how many therapists does it take to make one Sam? I'm sharing this so that you don't worry about me, in part. Thank you for that, by the way. And also so that you can see my example. You don't have to face your shadows alone either. Even if you don't have a Sam just yet, simply having the framework helps so that you know what's happening if you find yourself confronting any part of your shadow. And having better questions to ask helps too. Better questions in this context is going to be things like, why did I feel like I needed to exile that part? Why did I feel safer forgetting that part of my story? What was I told about that part of me or that experience? Looking at that now, do I still think it's true? And you can also ask, what is the innocence in that part of yourself? Or what resources might that part of you bring with it? Or how might that part of you restore balance to your sense of self if you integrate it? Having a friend or a mentor or a therapist as a compassionate witness makes us feel better in this whole process because it reminds us that we're not alone and that this part of us that we thought we had to cast away can in fact be welcome in the presence of other people. We can also self-witness with journaling and with art, letting our compassionate adult self who exists now in this moment support our past self who was less resourced, or maybe even our child self who felt so scared and ashamed. We can engage in practices that deliberately bring us into contact with parts of us that we might have been avoiding or might not feel ready to see. This can be meditation, shamanic journeying, active imagination, maybe even prayer if we're trying to connect with a higher power or maybe the wisdom of an elder, even just our own inner wisdom, that intuitive voice that can sometimes be very hard to hear over the hustle and bustle of daily life. If you have an uncomfortable truth surface into your awareness, that means your psyche believes you are ready to face and absorb that truth, to bring that part of you into your conscious sense of self, to stretch your egoic identity to account for that part of yourself. Another way to think of it might be that your sense of conscious identity is ready for an upgrade. If you can look at your shadow that way and embrace the growing pains, then honestly, Mordor kind of loses its terrors. It can be a fun run. You get muddy and you fall down a few times, sure, but on the other side of it, you're stronger and you're standing taller in your own truth. So that's all for this week. If you need me, I'll be crawling face first through some black mud on the south slope of Mount Doom for a bit. I mean, no wonder I look like a Nazgul in that mirror. But you can find out more about my work at thepatternbreaker.com. You can follow me on Instagram at thepatternbreaker. You can check out my Patreon for some cool perks at patreon.com/narrative responsibility. And until next time, what part of your story are you going to take responsibility for this week?